So today we're guests of Nick Paciorek. I'll try to introduce you as I know you, and if I miss something, just add. A builder,
Builder,
a artist,
an artist,
a craftsman,
craftsman,
a winemaker.
winemaker. If everything doesn't work out, I could always be a winemaker. That's what I've been told.
Which
So,
one's the most valuable to you?
most valuable? My art. That's just that's a given. I'm doing something I said I was going to do when I was 5 years old, and some people say I want to be a baseball player, I want to be a football player, and I'm doing what I said I was going to do when I was 5 years old.
And how did you get to it?
My uncle was an artist in California, and we went out and visited him. I was 5 years old, and one day I sat in his studio, and he had a blank canvas, and he created something out of nothing. And I sat there, I was a little kid, you're just, I sat on the steps, I was just quiet, and I watched him sit and create something out of nothing, a blank canvas. And I remember I told my mother, she was sitting in the kitchen having a cup of coffee, and I said, Mom, one day I'm going to be an artist.
How did she react?
Well, I think like every parent, when a 5-year-old tells you that, it's even scarier, I think. You're like, yeah, okay. And then throughout my life, some of the things I always would mention to her have came true. And that's a really, sometimes when I hit a strive or I hit something and I'm like, I had this conversation with my mother when I was very young. I told her I was sitting in State Street in Chicago, watching a parade when I was a little kid, and she would go shopping. This is when you can leave kids on the sidewalk, get a hot dog. Here's your hot chocolate. Don't move. We're going shopping, and I told her, I said, one day I'm gonna paint this parade. And then I'll never forget, I was in the Macy's Day Parade. I was being commissioned to do work for Macy's, and I'm sitting there, and after I talked to my wife at the time. I said, I told my mother this when I was 7 years old, that I was going to do this. And I said, yeah, it just came true, true. I don't know
Yeah.
the cosmics and all that stuff, but I and it was just really interesting, so, and there's a lot of that in my life. So that's always been a great thing.
Okay. And who were your parents? What were they doing?
My parents were, working class people. They were, my father, I think my father wanted to be an artist, but when he died, I think, the priest gave a whole sermon also about that. And his brother was very creative, but he also had 5 kids. And he was very creative.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of making things work, how things worked and things like that. My mother was much more a cultural person. She worked at the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
but in terms of cultural, in terms of the Italian culture, she always would try to get me, in the neighborhood we lived in, there was always opera going on and things like that. People were singing and things, and she would tend to try to get me to go to the opera more. And for my preference at the time, I wasn't drawn to opera as much as ballet and music and some of the other things. So I always found that interesting because she loved that part.
Did you start? When did you start drawing? When did you start putting
I
splashes of paint on something?
So I started drawing. I don't remember not drawing,
Okay.
and so the crayon, and we had a talk here at the Pitcher Golf House about a crayon that was your first thing that you were excited about to work with and draw. That was pretty much the things I start remembering, how I drew with a crayon. Robert De Niro's father, we had this whole conversation when I was in college, and he created with crayons, and I thought it was very primitive because that's where we all started this communication with drawing. So I've drawn kind of forever, and even it's funny, I talk to my brothers or sisters, or even classmates.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, "You were always drawing. You were always that kid." drawing and creating stuff and things like that. So I'm trying to do my work, but I was always drawing, and some people say doodles or how you lay out the page. But yeah, I was always drawing and always creating. Just visually how I seen things. So
Okay. So for high school, did you do any sports? Did you do
yeah,
any other stuff, or
yeah.
you were just more of a bookish kid?
No, I wasn't a bookish kid. I was. You'd probably say I was an odd kid because I would be.
Still is.
Yeah, I still am. But like wrestling, I was a wrestler, football player, baseball player,
Okay.
and then it came to a point, and I think maybe a junior in high school, and I had some great coaches, and they were actually involved in the arts. Actually, they loved art and things, and they literally said to me, said, "You know what? You're a much better artist than you will ever be an athlete." and and they said, "You really better think about where you're going to put your next foot forward." And they said, we love you as this point, what you do, but there's other things in your life that should maybe take precedence. Now, and this is coming from a coach and things. So I was pretty intrigued, just as when I would go to wrestling camp at the University of Iowa. There was a wrestler, an Olympic wrestler, that used to teach there, Dan Gable. Dan Gable came, and we would sit around and we would talk and things. And he came up to me one time and he looked me right in the eye with this fierce intensity. He's like, "I don't care what you do in life, but it better be intense and you better do it." And I was like, "Oh, this guy has a point here." You don't have to be, but some of the teachings that I got from that, yeah, I was no Olympic athlete, not even close. But I think what some of those things bring to the individuals are very important. So,
Okay. So which school did you go after that? What university or you
I went
college
to
you
the
went?
art and so I was fortunate because I grew up in Chicago, and I had access to the train. So the train, when you're 11 years old and living in the city, you just that's how you transport yourself. You don't have to call mom or dad or take me here. So I had access to the train. My brothers and sisters didn't realize because they were older than me, how much I was doing different things with the train. I was able to go to the Art Institute. I was able to go to different places. So, and I always worked. So I had the means financially to say, "Oh, I'm going to take a class at the Art Institute when I'm young." And my mother knew this. She knew that he's going to do what he's going to do because I was the youngest. So I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, the Maryland Institute. I took classes there, and I was always on the train. It seemed like I was always running from somewhere to another place, and then I decided to transfer to the Maryland Institute College of Art. And it was a scenario that I said, okay, this is going to be my senior year, just pulling out of being a sophomore. How am I going to, do this art thing? And I said, well, I got to eliminate running around on the train. So I wasn't living in the downtown by myself. I was living at home, doing different things, making sure I was working, making sure of finances. So I made the move to Maryland, the Maryland Institute College of Art. And the reason I chose that school was a much more classically trained school. And also it had access to Washington, D.C. So, and in Washington, D.C., there's so many museums and institutions, and it's close to, Philadelphia with the Barnes Foundation, things like that. So that's when I felt I was starting to develop my own language in reference to my art. And I was able to because I had less aspects of running around, family obligations and things like that. It wasn't the fact that the family wasn't important. It was just I knew that I had to do this for my career and my education.
Okay. So, since we touched a little bit on developing the language, were you always wanted to be in this realm of Fauvism, or you brought yourself to that with time?
I brought myself to that with time. I mean, figuratively, I did so much figurative work. I mean, sculpting, uh, drawing the figure. I was so involved in the figure, figures in, settings, nudes, whatever for so long. And I developed in reference to more looking at landscape or cityscapes and how people interact in their environments more as opposed to just an individual, or portraiture. I think, now where I'm looking at in my world of painting, I think I'm developing a little bit more, going back to a little bit more figurative work that I see that's in my drawings and ideas that are in my sketchbooks that I would go to.
Are you still going back to your previous material, or you're
Well,
pushing yourself forward?
for me, I always go somewhere with that. So I have something that I tell my friends is that I'm always working. And they're like, "What do you mean you're always working?" I said, I bring my sketchbook with me sometimes in my camera. And I said, sometimes we'll be in Paris or something. And all of a sudden, they're like, "Where did he go? Where did Nick go?" And, I'm sitting there drawing or doodling or having something like that that's important to me, that it's in the sketchbook. Now, 5 years later or something, sometimes you're looking through that and it's like, that was a very interesting idea. That was a good idea. So for me, some people have artist block, some people have writer's block and things. I've always used my sketchbook, my material and things and writings that whenever I feel like I want a new direction or I want something new, I go back and look at that, because sometimes we take these ideas and we put them away and we let them grow and bubble up, and then maybe we're a little bit more mature now, and then we could go grab them and then look at them and formulate them. So
So, is there certain themes or certain technique styles you're going back to?
I moved the studio out to the carriage house, and I think I have enough room in enough other places that I may start sculpting again. Um, Sculpture, I have friends, a few friends that are very prominent sculptors in a country that I went to school with, and I love their work. I also sculpted with them, but I always looked at sculpture as, man, it's heavy.
It is.
It's heavy. You gotta carry this stuff. You got the truck. You don't have trucks. You got big
It's
trucks.
physical labor.
Yeah, and and it's like, this stuff's really heavy. It's like, it feels like everything you're doing with it is heavy, and it is beautiful. It's you can almost get the feeling of air with it and things like that with sculpture, but it's just so heavy. So I think I have a space that I could work with sculpture a little bit more, just as I moved my studio out there so I could go back to doing larger paintings, also.
So, is there a spark that brings certain work to the attention immediately, or is it just repetition and the discipline of working every day? What's more important for you?
For me, I always have a project, a direction going on, or writings. So right now I'm finishing up, let's say, a floral show, and I know that I also have galleries I'm supplying at the beaches or the islands. So the next set of stuff as I finish this type of show is going to island work. And then I know that I have a whole crew racer series that I'm going to formulate. So I'm already starting to figure out the canvas size for the crew racers, that will be produced probably in the fall, the early fall. So I'm always kind of ahead of that game. I'm kind of making little tear papers and little drawings of things that for next winter.
Okay.
It's winter now, but so I'm always kind of thinking ahead and drawing and thinking it's a great idea, a horrible idea.
Here's an interesting thing that you just touched, producing. Because right now, a lot of people, younger kids that coming out, they want to be this artist. They want to be the next someone. And what's more important for a person who's starting to do it every day, to plan something ahead, to or to just come up with their own creative idea and try to, in your point of view, doing it so many years, what would be more important? Because you are sometimes, it sounds right now like you're looking at it as a production sequences, which is, for me, it's understandable. You need to plan your cycle ahead of time. You need to work on certain things as the season, because it's not just, you're not just producing for yourself. It's your business.
Right.
It's your craft, and to be a craftsman, you need to be able to sell your craft. So, what would be for the young person be more important from your point of view?
So when I teach a workshop, I usually this is the first thing I say first of all, check your ego at the door, and then some people look at me. I said, check your ego at the door, and one other thing, I said, don't try to paint like me. And all of a sudden people look and it's like, what do you mean? We took your workshop and things like that. I said, I'm taken. I don't try to paint like me, because the world wants you. They want your ideas, your thought, your obsessiveness, because it'll come through. That's why they'll gravitate towards your work. I said, I'm here as an instructor to basically take you someplace and push you in a direction that you're interested and excited about. So, and I think that comes about with working every day. And also, it's okay to make bad paintings. Or,
It's difficult.
Well,
because we all have ambitions, we all have a certain idea about ourselves. So to make a bad something can be discouraging for someone.
Well, and I also tell students, so that they understand this. Every one of my drawings and every one of my paintings start like this. This is the greatest thing I've ever thought of. I'm in it. I'm drawing. I'm painting. It's the greatest thing, and I'm within maybe an hour, and it's like, oh my God, I don't even think I could paint anymore. I don't even know what I'm really doing. All right, I have to tell myself I'm a professional. I did this before. You work through the problems. That's part of what this is, and you keep going. And all of a sudden, it comes to a point, and it's like, it's not so bad. Oh, what happened? So I think being able to identify that you've been there before, you know how it could be to feel a bad painting, a bad sculpture, a bad thing, and how you work through this for you to have your language, come out. And I think, as opposed to just throwing it all aside and walking out the studio, we're, as artists, we're very fortunate to have this studio that we create in, and nobody sees it until, not all the time, until we hang it on the wall and we put ourselves out there. But what makes it, when it's ready to go out there, there's all this other stuff that happens in between that you have to have the confidence to go forward. And that comes with, I think, time. It comes with realizing that everything you do is not going to be the greatest piece you ever made, but you have to strive for your vision.
So you have to be disciplined, you have to be ambitious, and you have to be learn on your previous mistakes. Would that be the?
I almost don't want to say the word mistakes. It's a learning thing. So if you say, okay, I mix this color, I mix that color, I don't like how that reacts with this, and I'm using that in terms of paint, but we could talk about that in anything you do in life, writing, singing,
Yes.
and if you do enough of it, it almost comes. Sometimes people will say, "Oh, it's so easy for you to, paint. You seem like it's with ease." It's like that because when I was 11 years old and I was mixing these colors or mixing certain things or doing a certain drawing, all that's still stored in my mind and how I work. It's always evolving. So sometimes people say, "Yeah, I've been painting for 5 years, but I don't think I could do that." Well, you know, paint for paint for 50 years, and then let's see if you still have that same conversation. Probably not.
Probably not because you develop certain things. Yes, you create certain things that you create certain bank of information
Yeah.
that you're constantly using. But going back to how you were trained and how it was trained in the you're not that old, but in the
Yeah.
old days, when people were copying someone else's work. Because right now, a lot of, and that's just not just with art, it's also with some people in my field. People try to create original work right away without knowing fundamentals. So you were fortunate enough to study, to go to good museums, to compare, to look, to generate this bank of information. Would it be beneficial for the young person to study, or would it be beneficial for the young artist to create their own?
I. It is so important to learn either we'll use the word classical or discipline aspect of it before you're able to branch out in terms of start throwing abstracts or different things. And what struck me more, I think, in my life than anything is I seen Picasso's and Matisse's cast drawings. They're very classically, I was blown away about their hand, how they could create with this, the subtleties. And I really looked at these cast drawings, and they had an understanding of all these things that happen. And then they branched off of that. But they didn't come out one day and create Guernica. There was so much there to get to that point, and he had a mastery of that. And we could all talk about there were certain times that it just didn't work anymore, or maybe he was older, he was just throwing things out there. But that jump when you see somebody in a classically trained uh, you know arts and whatever, even and I even probably say that with music, they a music classically trained musician that even has taken that jump, they understand how that all works, that pitch, and it's an older music or an older theater or an older way of acting, but they grasp that concept and they put it in their bank, their personal bank, that they could feed off it and they could use it. And I think that's really important. There's some people, actually, they always don't teach this at institutions anymore. Not all institutions, but there's also somebody, in New England that is actually teaching this type of cash drawing still to students. and some of the work is just really interesting that's coming out of it, but they're classically trained. And then they're going to progress. They will progress. They're not going to sit there and draw casts for the rest of their lives, but man, they have knowledge of shadow, tone, how composition lays on the page and everything by just being able to draw for that bank. I was fortunate being able to live in Chicago. The collection of impressionist work there and different art that I could just sit in front of a painting for a half hour and study it is it's tremendous. And I think younger people should utilize those aspects of art, even if they're taking that direction, to be able to look in front of a classical piece of art and where does that pertain to what they're doing. So I feel that's very important. It's almost, and I don't want to say it's a derivative that should be definitely done, but it'll make them better artists and also branch out.
Let's try to go a little bit different direction. So I introduced you as a builder.
Mhm.
How did you get to it?
So growing up, my father worked for a large developer, and so we they would send me out. You're a young kid. You're excited. He's like, you go with the concrete crew. You go with the carpentry crew one summer. You go with the road crew. You go with the sewer guys, things like this. And I think part of that was, well, they could always make a living, whatever they did, or they can't. But it was just like, you need to work. You need to, get that discipline of going up every day. So I was always involved in that when I was very young. I was able to put myself through school that way. Working like that, and when I moved to Rhode Island, I was just painting, totally strictly painting, and still being able to create in things, and my studio burned.
But were you able to support yourself at that point?
Yeah.
With paintings? Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
and I still totally. I do, but I still like to have my aspect in building and creating things, and part of that I think comes from I still want to sculpt that place. I want to make something out of nothing, just as my studios or or my house here. That was when I bought the house. This project, it was uninhabitable, So what do you do? How do you create that? My other, gallery at Art Prop Gallery in Providence, I remember my mother-in-law and father-in-law came in and they started crying. They were like, what'd you just do? It was an old jewelry manufacturing company. And I said, well, this is my vision and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to cut this space up and, our studios are going to be here. And then I'm going to rent some space out, and maybe long term we have our gallery here, and that's what we did. But that's always been a part of my life. It always will be a part of my life. Creating spaces. I'm right now creating a space out in my carriage house that I think is going to be a very interesting space that I could work at, live there, but it's where my studio is. So there's always those challenges there. But it really, the day my studio burned, and I had nothing, except the shirt on my back, I said, "What are you going to do today?" And I started, I started back into that. And I just said, I don't need to necessarily get rid of this totally, and I could always create with it.
So percentage-wise, what do you spend on one and the other?
That's hard, because I'm always painting. I'm probably right now, if I looked at it right now, I'm probably about 30/70. I'm in the 70 art. So things change in terms of economies, years, things that you do. But I'm still at the point where I have a lot of energy for my work. So when I say my work, I just have a lot of energy. Part of that, people ask me, well, how do you have energy for all this stuff? How do you do that? Blah blah. How do you have all? And and I tell them, well, for me, I could be in the studio 24/7, literally 24/7. And I had one art dealer that actually told my wife, said, you should just chain him to the easel and throw meat at him, and and just keep him painting. But I found that if that's all I do in life, and I love it. If that's all I do in life, I'm not going to be a good artist, because I need to draw on information out here in the world and experience it. And if I'm in that studio just kind of locked up and don't see what's going on in the world, design, what's going on in housing, what's going on in all this, I don't, I'll be a bad artist. And, so I look at part of what different things I do as they make me a better artist. I love skiing, I love climbing. I'm looking at winter landscapes at times. I love gardening. I love putting, flower arrangements together sometimes. So I think all of that just makes you a better artist and a better person, more well-rounded. Some people say you're a very Renaissance person, things like that. But just as wine, I love the fact that I can make wine. I'm taking a grape, I'm bringing the barrels, I'm fermenting different things, So, but I feel it makes me a better artist.
Okay. I mean, for you personally, what holds more weight? The financial aspect of financial success of artwork, or the recognition of your peers?
Um, that's an interesting question. I don't the financial aspect. I've learned that I can make money at my art. I'm very fortunate at that. And I think I'm at the point right now is my peers, I don't, they may not like my work. And, but that's okay. I don't care about that if they don't like it. I think I put myself out there and they respect that. That the fact that this is a person that, maybe the highs and lows have happened to him, but he's still putting himself out there. He's still putting himself on the wall. The hard thing sometimes that artists, I think, need to get through is that you create this thing that you think is unbelievable, and the market doesn't love it. The market is financial part.
Yeah.
That messes with you financially. But then your peers say this is an unbelievable piece. Financially, nobody liked it. So do you focus on only painting for the financial part? For me, no. I have, just as I tell my students in workshops, that you need to be you. Because if you're not you, the marketplace ain't gonna love you. So when you create you, and some of that comes from making bad paintings. You don't intentionally go, I'm going to make a bad painting. It just happens that maybe things didn't work. Maybe things work 10 years from now. I keep an inventory of paintings, and there's paintings that I don't know why they didn't sell 10 years ago. I bring them out, people are like, oh, they did, where did these paintings come from?
Yes, certainly. Certain themes, certain things are yes. But but that type of thinking you always had, or is that evolved with time?
Well, it probably evolved with time. When I was fortunate also that I came out of art school as an undergrad, and I had a gallery, and I started selling out shows that instructors told me that just doesn't happen. So the financial part of it, I knew I could make money with my art. How much money? How much do I want? I've always said to myself, I want enough money in my life financially that I could buy books, I could go to the play, I could go to the theater, I could have supplies. I don't need a boat, a massive boat. I need a boat. I think I don't need a boat. I don't need that. There's certain things we don't need in our lives that we have to, have money to create that. So it's kind of all fell into place in those regards. I mean, I even they ask me sometimes to teach the business side of art, and I kind of don't want to, because sometimes artists are not always business people, but we also have to realize there's a financial part that we got to put food on the table, and we have to realize what's going on in order to create our art. And if you don't, it's when you don't have supplies, how are you going to create it?
When you don't have food, how are you going to create it?
Right. So those are, things that, we have to ask ourselves.
Okay. You traveled a lot. I know you traveled extensively in the States or outside. What are your most favorite places, museums, or other places that you draw your inspiration or just charge your battery on?
Charge my battery. And I'll, this one of my favorite places I went to, and it was a childhood dream, and was still St. Petersburg, Russia, during the White Nights.
Mm-hmm.
That was for me, because I said when I was very young, I said I'm from Chicago. I didn't know how to experience these white nights. What do you mean these white nights? And it's like, the light's different and things. There's great museums there. And so I was able to go to St. Petersburg. But the interesting thing, I remember I was, because we had I had a show there. And I remember a journalist asked me, well, what do you think of the Hermitage? And the whole breadth of the room was waiting for this answer, and I said, I think the Hermitage is a great museum, but I prefer the Russian Museum. And you heard the gasp in the room, and she was like, but they were almost offended, and I said, and I explained to him why. For me as an artist, I said I went to the Russian Museum and I learned about Russian culture more. And I said, I seen Ilya Ripin's paintings that you don't see a lot of times in the world. And I said, I've used museums as not an icon place that they have a Picasso, they have a Matisse, they have a Gauguin. I've used them as educational parts for my life. So, which I always have. So that's one aspect. The Barnes Foundation for me is a special place, just because of the collection, and also something that they created there in terms of allowing people to educate themselves. The Gardner Museum in Boston is another special place. Visually, architecturally, it's a special place. But also what she did in terms of bringing some of the work here to the States. the I always tell people that are going to Rome. I said, and they, people, what would you suggest? I mean, obviously the fact. I said, well, go to the Borghese Garden. What do you mean Borghese Garden? Well, no, the Borghese Museum at the gardens. I said, for me, those are the best sculpture that Bernini has. I said, that I've ever seen. It's the air, the lightness of marble, and I just, for me, I have not seen anything as a collection that in marble that duplicates that many of beauty. I said, so for me, and people ask. So those are a couple that, and I will always have the Art Institute of Chicago as my primary, primary source of things. I tell people also to get the museum pass, that you could go to different museums throughout the country. And people are like, yeah, but that's the pass is like $250. And I tell them, I said, yeah, but what it does for me is when I'm in a city, I could go to the museum for 2 hours. I don't feel I have to pay the $40 fee, the $50 fee, and I have to be at that museum for that long. Because for me, also, I can only be there for so long because I'm so stimulated. I'm bringing my sketchbook and I'm educating myself on what's there in Dublin or in Chicago or at the Met or in Boston. So now it allows me to have access to different museums for that 1, 2, 3 hours without being there for the whole day. And it just makes it a more enjoyable experience. So.
Okay. One thing I forgot to mention, the stewardship of this wonderful building that we're in. I mean, without good craftsmen and this craftsmanship that we see around us, this fireplace that's carved, that's clay work and everything else, is what pushed you to take such an incredible amount of work to even move in here and to start bringing it to what it was in some senses, creating your own space in it.
Yeah. Well, the Picture Golf House, I knew of it. It was the old Children's Museum. Mm-hmm. I walked into the space, and there was no intent. I came in here, and I said, well, I want to look at the building. It was for sale, and I walked around and I'm like, this is an amazing building. It's just an amazing building. There are a lot of the things were taken out of here in reference to stained glass windows, a lot of the architecture, some of the elements. There was no kitchen, bathrooms were in such disrepair, all of it was uninhabitable. And I looked at it and said, this is the place. And a lot of my friends, trust me, a lot of my friends were like, you're out of your mind to do this. And I asked them, I told them, I said, well, who else is going to do this? And they kind of looked at me. I said, they'll tear this house down. I mean, the stairwell, let's disassemble the stairwell, let's disassemble the mantles, let's start selling this off. And I said, but this is a part of history. This is a part of the history of Rhode Island. It's part of the history of Pawtucket. It's part of the cultural history of actually our country. When you really research the house and who had the house, some of the decisions that were to be decided in this room. And I said, I'm going to take the project on. I needed a place where my collection was going to end up, where people could see a collection, where I could work my studio, and have a place for long term that could grow. And I said, it is scary. It was terrifying in terms of, actually doing it. But I'm not afraid of the challenges that came about. So this wasn't a blank canvas when I got it. It was a canvas that was pretty messed up, and now I had to organize it in my way, and I still am. It's still always going to evolve in terms of how I want to live and how I want people to see artwork. Because it isn't always just about my artwork, it's about a collection that I have collected and also showing other artists' work.
Okay. I mean, it's a colossal work. I've seen it in the beginning.
It is, and the other thing was kind of interesting is when people that haven't been here in a while, or when they first seen the house, and you've been here a little bit more than other people. You'll come in and different things and different things that I do at different times. So you've slowly seen it evolve. But people who have not slowly seen it evolve, and all of a sudden they come in, and they're like, "This place has just changed," and it's like, yeah, it has. Just as everybody's been in my house. This was the Rhode Island Children's Museum, and I've literally been on planes going to Europe, and just talking to somebody next to you, and it's like, yeah, where do you live? I just Pawtucket, I bought the old Children's Museum, blah blah. I've been in your house. That's kind of an odd thing, I don't know. Everybody in the world says, oh, I've been in your house. It's like, when did you break in? You want to ask them this question. But so a lot of people have been here, and a lot of people have. Whenever they do come here, they do see the house, how it's evolved. So I always find that interesting too. So.
Thank you for keeping it up. Thank you for your stewardship of this place. It's certainly, I understand it's a lot of work, but thank you. A couple of rapid questions. You don't have to, just a few words, maybe even answer. Nothing really extensive. So, an artist is someone who
sees a vision and puts it out there to the public.
Okay. A main task of an artist is to
create for themselves and let critics decide where it belongs.
Okay. An artist should always
create for themselves.
Okay. To become an artist, you need to
discipline.
Okay. And one last question. What is a success for you?
What is a success? Being able to wake up and create. It really is, because it just as when I first seen a blank canvas, and now I could create something out of nothing. That's still the important thing in life. If it's a building, if it's an empty room, how you're going to create it. To be able to create something out of nothing in my head and using my hands and my body, that's it. That's the pinnacle for me.
Oh, great. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure. It's a pleasure to know you. It's a pleasure to be around you. And thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.